Good morning, students. This is Dr. Priyanka, and today we will be discussing experimental research design. What do you understand by experimental research? A research investigation in which conditions are controlled. We somehow control some conditions and we let some conditions flow so as to check them whether by controlling one condition, another condition is being changed, improved, or not at all. Nothing is happening, or maybe it is neutral, you can say, right? One independent variable is manipulated. Sometimes more than one variables are also being manipulated in experimental research, and its effect on a dependent variable is measured to test a hypothesis. So basically, experimental research is a research investigation in which conditions are controlled and one independent variable is manipulated, sometimes more than one also, and its effect on a dependent variable is measured to test a hypothesis. Basic issues. Manipulation of the independent variable. We always manipulate independent variable. The variable on which we are measuring its effect is dependent variable. As the name also says, dependent, that variable is dependent on something, and that dependency of the variable is on independent variable. And independent variable is the only variable which can be manipulated here. Dependent variable is always checked with the help of manipulating the independent variable. Then selection of dependent variable, it is a very careful step. If you have not chosen dependent variable carefully, then you might get distorted results. Then assignment of subjects or say test units. This is really important, that how you would be checking these variables. Test unit might be one individual, test unit might be one household, test unit might be one company, one institute, or anything, right? But you have to assign that what test unit you are going to observe. Are you going to observe one company as test unit? You might, for example, you want to observe 100 companies for 1 year, so your test unit here would be one company, and you are observing 100 test units for 1 year. Control over extraneous variables. This is really very important. There are some variables which are actually affecting dependent variable, and they are trying to reduce the effect of independent variable on that dependent variable. So this also distort the results of experiment. So that is why controlling extraneous variable is more important than actually manipulation of independent and selection of dependent variable. There are certain things. Let us go through some slides and then we will discuss one example so as to understand what actually experiment means. The experiment has the experimenter has some degree of control over the independent variable. Experimenter can only control the independent variable. If you will be controlling dependent variable, then there is no use of any experiment, right? Because we want to check the impact on dependent variable. That is why we will not do anything with dependent variable. That would be taken as such, so as to actually check the impact of other variables on that dependent variable. The variable is independent because its value can be manipulated by the experimenter to whatever he or she wishes it to be. We are calling, for example, we have got two variables. We can call any one variable as independent and any one as dependent variable. It is not like that we the variable we are calling as dependent, we will be changing that, and another the one variable which is independent, that would be affected. No. So we are having two variables in our hand. One would be independent. The variable which we are calling as independent would be changed by the experimenter so as to check the impact of that particular change on dependent variable. For example, you might want to check the impact of advertisement expenditure on sales. So advertisement expenditure over here is independent variable and sales is dependent variable. So you might do one thing. For example, you know that in previous year you have spent 1 lakh rupee on one particular advertisement per day, right? So that means you have spent 365 lakh rupees on one particular product for just for advertisement in 1 year, and you got some sales, right? In even in previous year you have spent some money on advertisement. You can collect the data of last 10 years, last 5 years, maybe last 2-3 years, the data of expenditure on advertisement, right? And on the basis of that you can check how much it has affected the sales of that particular product, right? One is advertisement expenditure and another one is sales. So you will be checking the impact of advertisement expenditure on sales now. So now what you can do is you can change advertisement expenditure in next year up to certain extent. Maybe you can increase as well, increase the expenditure, you can decrease the expenditure. You can take 4-5 variations and then you can check that impact on sales. You can check whether sales is increasing, whether sales is decreasing, or up to what extent sales is increasing. So you can decide accordingly how much to spend on advertisement so as to achieve one particular level of sales. So this is how experiment works. You are trying to check on the basis of either on the basis of past values of advertisement expenditure and sales. You can decide how much to spend in coming years on expenditure on advertisement so as to get required sales. Or you can actually manipulate independent variable. If in some other case independent variable can be manipulated, and you can actually check the impact on dependent variable, that how much the variable was affected. So that is why independent variable is called independent, because it is not dependent on any variable here. We can move it as per our choice, and we will be checking its impact on dependent variable. That is why the variable is called dependent, because its value is dependent on some other variable. How much you will get sales is dependent on your advertisement expense. Though some other variables are also affecting the sales, we will discuss those variables as well in the same video. But the main point is independent variable is affecting dependent variable, and independent variable here is the expenditure you will be doing on advertisement, and dependent variables is final sales. Alternative manipulations of the independent variable are being investigated. Alternative manipulations means you will actually be manipulating independent variables value, and on that basis you will be checking whether dependent variable is getting affected or not, and up to how much it is being affected. What is independent variable? The experimenter controls independent variable. The variable's value can be manipulated by the experimenters to whatever they wish it to be. This is the variable whose value is to be controlled by the experimenter. The variable whose value is controlled is independent. It is not dependent on anyone. Then manipulated independent variable can be like classificatory versus continuous variables. What do you mean by classification and what is continuous? For example, you are measuring a person's height. It is continuous, like it starts from 0 and it is continuously, you can actually point anything like 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 anywhere. It is continuous, it is not breaking anywhere. Classificatory means you can classify things. For example, gender, male and female, that is a kind of classification. That is not continuous variables. Either you'll have a value of 0 or 1. It is not like 0 0.1, 2, 3, 4 up to 1. No, just two variables are there, two values are there, 0 or 1, or you can point it as 1 or 2. But when it comes to continuous variable, the value is continuous. Experimental and control groups. Experimental, there are always two groups. One group is controlled and another is one is experimental. How experimental group would always be manipulated, and that can sometimes be called as independent, and sometimes some other variables also come up rather than independent variable. We will discuss it in another one or two slides. Experimental group generally are manipulated by the experimenter, and control groups are those which are kept as such so as to check the difference between two groups. For example, you have got 20 people in a group. You will divide the group in two parts, 10 and 10 in each group. Now you will be studying these 20 people in two different groups. One group of 10 people would be experimented, and another group of 10 people would be left as such, like they would not be experimented, they would not have any restriction over on them, right? And you will just be observing them. Treatment levels. There might be different level of treatment. You can just have one level of treatment, you can have two levels of treatment. For example, you might be interested in observing a group just for 1 hour a day, or maybe 2 hours a day, 4 hours a day, 6 hours a day, or maybe you might be observing them just any time for 1 hour, or maybe 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the afternoon, and 1 hour in the evening. So there might be different levels of treatments. That depends on the experiment you are going to have. For example, when it comes to companies, we are talking about business research here. Most of our researches would be related to the companies. You can observe companies, maybe generally companies are observed at the time of, or you can say generally companies are observed annually. You can observe companies annually, or maybe on daily basis, or maybe quarterly when they provide their financial results, right? So it depends what kind of treatment you want to go for when it comes to companies: daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or annually. It depends on the level of the kind of experiment you are going for. Yes, more than one independent variable. Yes, any study can have more than one independent variable, but dependent variable would always be one. No, there is no study, at least in one experiment, there is no study where more than one dependent variable would be there, but you can have multiple independent variables over there. Experimental treatments, the alternative manipulations of the independent variable being investigated. Experimental treatments means the kind of manipulations you will be doing, alternative manipulations you can go for. It's not necessary you can just manipulate the variable once. You can manipulate variable multiple times, and you can check the effect on dependent variable n number of times. Dependent variable. What do you mean by a dependent variable? As the name suggests, the variable is dependent on something. So its value is expected to be dependent on experimenter's manipulation, and experimenter's manipulation is independent variable. So this variable is dependent on independent variable. Dependent variable is dependent, and independent is non-dependent. You can remember it that ways also. Dependent means dependent on something, and independent means non-dependent. Criteria or standard by which the results are judged. What kind of the criteria you are going for, but you just have to remember that you will be taking one particular criteria for all the manipulations. Otherwise, you might get distorted results. You have to fix one criteria and you keep that for the whole experiment. Dependent variables might be sales volume, awareness, recall, or their measurement unit is very important. You should decide the measurement unit beforehand. For example, you might be going to observe sales of one particular company, or maybe you have got 10 companies whose sales comparison you are going to do. So you need to check whether their sales is in millions, billions, or something, right? You have to take all the companies in one unit. I mean, sales, if you are taking company sales, either all of them should be in millions or all of them should be in billions. Unit of measurement should be same. Otherwise, you will not get accurate results. You might get accurate results, but you will not be able to handle them. You will not be able to analyze them properly, because you also don't know what is wrong with the results. Test units. Yes, test unit is very important. Subjects or entities whose response to the experimental treatment are measured or observed. Like, are you observing an individual for any kind of variable, or are you observing one household as a whole unit? For example, it doesn't matter how many people are there in that particular household, right? One individual household, or maybe one company, or maybe one industry. So it depends what you are going to actually check. Who are your experimental groups. So you actually need to define it beforehand, that what is your test unit, whether it is an individual, or it is a household, or it is a company, or it is a group of companies. Anything can be a test unit. Elimination of extraneous variables. What do you mean by extraneous variables? First of all, let us discuss that. Number of extraneous variables may affect the dependent variables, thereby distorting the experiment. We know that variable is affecting the dependent variable, right? For example, we were just talking about advertisement expenditure is affecting the sales volume. That's okay. But sometimes, what is your brand reputation? What is the age of the company? Sometimes you are like, no, I trust this particular company, so I will be buying product from this company only. Whether they have advertised or not, you will be going to that particular company. There are some customers who will not be dependent on advertisements, right? So there are certain other things which also affect your dependent variable, irrespective of whatever independent variable is. So these are called extraneous variables. Sometimes more than one independent variable is there, that is different. But some variables which we might not consider, but they are actually affecting the dependent variable, these are actually called extraneous variable. So their elimination is very important. Otherwise, you will be getting distorted results. You will not get actual results, which is to be known to you. Like, you are trying to manipulate one variable on the basis of which you are trying to get another variable's value, but those are being distorted by some other variable as well. So it is a kind of error, you can say. So this is to be manipulated. Then constancy of conditions. Yes, conditions should be constant. For example, you might be trying to check the kind of engine to be used. For example, you might go and check 10 engines, 10 10 different companies, but you will be getting different results from all of them. Then you should try to do one thing, that they all should be of same size and same type at least. Then only comparison matters. Otherwise, comparison would not matter. For example, two engines are of different sizes, then their efficiency might be different. That is of that is different. If they are of same size and then their efficiency is different, then it matters to us. Then we can decide whether which one is then we can decide that which engine is better than the other one, right? But if their size is different, then there is no use of getting the experiment done. So constancy of conditions should always be there. For example, you might be trying to compare between two cars. They are of different companies. That's okay, of course, that is why you are trying to check them, but their age should also be same. Then, for example, you are observing car A of which is 5 years old, and from car B which is 10 years old, then it doesn't make any sense. So constancy of condition should be there. Both those cars should be either 5 years old or 10 years old. Order of presentation. How are you presenting the things? That is also important. For example, sometimes what we do is we will be studying sales first, and then we will be studying the advertisement expenditure, right? And there are some other variables which are equally affecting the sales. For example, Advertisement has one more variable, which is called promotion. If you have done more promotion this year, so there might be a chance that you will be getting more sales volume rather than when you did less promotion. Advertisement expenditure might be same for both the years. So this is also important, that how you are actually posing, how you are actually presenting the things, in which order you are presenting them. Then random assignment. What do you mean by random assignment? Sometimes you have to go by the randomization of all the variables. If you decide one thing for one variable and you do not decide the same thing for another variable, that also harms. So randomization is very important. You should leave variables as on the basis of randomization sometimes. Matching subjects. Whenever you talk about two variables, you have to match them, like whether they should be taken in one particular equation or not. Matching of the subjects is very important. Like random assignment, matching subject is one another characteristic of extraneous variable. So that is why it is taken care of. For example, random assignment of subjects to the various experimental groups is the most common technique used to prevent test units from differing from each other on key variables. It assumes that all characteristics of these subjects have been similarly randomized. So you have to randomize all the characteristics of variables. Establishing control. How would you establish the control? This is also very important. Controls are basically established in experimental studies, and these are established on independent variables, and extraneous variables are just taken care of. They are not for establishing controls. So when we talk about establishing control, it is independent variable, no any other variable is being controlled. And some variables in the study are like that, which are considered as control variables. For example, when you are studying advertisement expenditures impact on sales volume, then there are certain other factors which are taken as control variable. For example, if you are studying 10 companies in a row and all 10 companies are are set up in between 1990 to 2000, then it is a kind of control variable for them. All 10 companies are from the same industry, so that is a kind of control variable. So some variables are there which can be considered as control variables. Yes, laboratory experiment versus field experiment. When we talk about field experiment, we had just studied survey experiment in the same unit. That is basically field experiment. When we talk about controlled studies, these are laboratory experiment. Laboratory experiments are generally artificially low realism, because you try to control certain things and on the basis of that you try to check the results. So its realism is very low. This is artificial basically. But in case of field experiment, you get natural results. So there is high realism. When it comes to laboratory experiments, then when it comes to laboratory experiments, few extraneous variables are there. But when it comes to field experiment, many extraneous variables are there, and controlling them is very important. In case of laboratory experiment, because we are posing artificial experiment, that is why extraneous variables are very few. Then high control, of course, because you are trying to control everything, control is very high here. But in case of field experiment, very low control is there, because you do not control things, you just go in the field and try to do the survey in your own way. That's it. There is almost no control when it comes to field experiments. Then laboratory experiments are a little less costly most of the times, and when it comes to field experiment, their cost is very high. And when it comes to duration part, laboratory experiments are for short duration, whereas field experiments are for long duration. That is one of the reason why its cost is higher. Then when it comes to laboratory experiment, subjects are aware of the participation, because you tell them that you are going to control them for such and such things, and that is how this experiment would be going on, and how the time period the experiment would take, that also is to be told to the subjects. So they are actually aware of the participation. But when it comes to field experiment, subjects are most of the times unaware of the participation. Sometimes this classification comes in the exam. What does an experimental when does an experiment have internal validity? First of all, what do you mean by internal ability? The ability of an experiment to answer the question whether the experimental treatment was the sole cause of changes in a dependent variable. This is something you are trying to check whether actually the distortions done by you, or maybe the control provided by you, was the sole reason to change the value of dependent variable, or there was something else. So there are so many methods to check internal validity. We will be covering this in another video. Now we'll just finish it with some true false and some questions. This is basically going to answer you, did the manipulation do what it was supposed to do or not? Basically, it is to check whether actually the independent variable affected dependent variable, or this is all done by extraneous variables or some other factors, right? Let us discuss some true false. Experimental research attempts to find causal relationships among variables. Is it? Yes, experimental research attempts to find causal relationships generally in among variables, and these variables are dependent and independent variables. Yes, it is true. Second is, in an experiment, the researcher manipulates the dependent variable and measures its effect on the independent variable. Is it? The researcher manipulates independent variable and measure its effect on dependent variable. So it is false. Third is, participants in experimental research are typically referred to as respondents. Is it? When we talk about experimental research, it is subjects. The research are typically referred to as participant in the research are typically referred to as subjects, not respondent. Respondents are we call participants as respondents in survey research, right? So it is false. An experimental construct refers to one of the possible levels of an experimental variable manipulation. Is it? No, this describes an experimental condition. So it is false. Fifth is, covariates are categorical variables such as a subject's gender or ethnicity, which are not manipulated but are included in the statistical analysis of experiments. No, categorical variables such as these are called blocking variables. These are not actually categorical variables. Then next is, an experiment treatment is the term referring to the way an experimental variable is manipulated. Is it? Yes, it is true. Next is, seventh is, a control group is one in which an experiment treatment is administered. No, this is actually the group which is left behind. This is actually the one in which experimental treatment is administered is called experimental group. Control group is one in which no experiment treatment is administered. Then 8, often the term linkage is used to refer a treatment combination with an experiment. Is it? The term is actually called cell. So it is false. 9th, experiments in which an individual subject is exposed to more than one level of an experiment treatment are referred to as repeated measures designs. Is it? Yes, it is true. Then an experiment can only have one experimental variable. Is it? No, experiments can have more than one independent variable or more than one experimental variables. Some questions. List the 4 important elements in experimental designs. What are the 4 important elements in experimental designs? Independent variable, dependent variable, experimental subjects, and control over extraneous variables. explain how systematic or non-sampling error occurs in experiments, and discuss ways to minimize it. Systematic or non-sampling errors, as we discussed in previous videos when it was survey errors, these may occur if the sampling units in an experiment cell are somehow different than the units in another cell, and this difference affects the dependent variable. That is how non-sampling error comes. These are called systematic errors. And randomization basically is something which can actually reduce this, which is the random assignment of subjects and treatments to group, is one device for equally distributing the effects of external variables to all conditions. So randomization here is the answer, and you can discuss it with one example. Third is list down an example of practical scenario with one dependent, two independent, and two control variables. Like I discussed an example of sales volume and advertisement. You have to generate one example by yourself, taking one business entity or any individual's case. That's all. Thank you.